This move immediately claims central space and opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, setting the stage for an active development and an aggressive, open game. 1. c5 immediately challenges white's central pawn and initiates the Sicilian defense. The most popular and theoretically rich response to 1. e4. Aiming for an asymmetrical pawn structure in dynamic counterplay. This move initiates the Sicilian defense, a dynamic and combative opening where white immediately challenges black's pawn on c5 and prepares to develop pieces actively to control the center. This move transposes into the French defense, a solid and strategically rich opening that aims to control the center with pawns and create complex pawn structures. This move initiates the open Sicilian, a fundamental and aggressive path where white seeks to exploit the central pawn majority and open lines for piece activity against black's less developed position. This captures the pawn and enters a common variation of the open Sicilian, aiming to challenge white's central pawn majority. This move recaptures the pawn in the center, developing a knight and preparing to castle, which is a standard continuation in the open Sicilian, leading to dynamic imbalances. This move, 4. a6, is a typical preparation in the Caro-Kann defense, specifically the advance variation, aiming to prevent white's knight from developing to b5 and to prepare for queenside pawn expansion. With b5, this move develops the bishop to a centralizing square, supporting a potential kingside attack and preparing for castling, while avoiding blocking the knight on f3 and maintaining flexibility. This move develops the knight and challenges white's central pawn, preparing to castle kingside and contest control of the d4 square. White castles kingside, securing the king and preparing to connect the rooks for future action on the open center. This move, d6, prepares to develop the light-squared bishop and strengthens the center, but allows white to achieve an ideal pawn structure in the main lines of the open Sicilian with a subsequent c4. This move solidifies white's central pawn control and prepares for a potential queenside expansion. With b4, fitting within the common structures of the Caro-Kann or Slav defenses. This move, 7. bd7, is a solid choice in the Sicilian defense, particularly the Scheveningen setup, preparing to challenge white's central pawn majority by offering to exchange the light-squared bishops. This move continues white's development and aims to control the center, reinforcing the d4 pawn and preparing further central action or kingside expansion. Developing the knight to c6 solidifies central influence and prepares for future pawn pushes, maintaining the character of a principled Sicilian defense continuation. This move prepares to develop the kingside bishop to a more active diagonal and supports the central pawn advance, aiming to control key squares and potentially prepare a queenside pawn push. This move, b7, is a standard developing move in this variation of the Sicilian defense, preparing to castle kingside and connect the rooks, while also preventing white's knight from coming to b5. This move is a prophylactic measure preventing the knight from moving to g4 and prepares to support the pawn on c4 if necessary. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, preparing to challenge white's central control and potentially support a kingside attack. This move prepares to castle kingside, consolidating white's development and improving the bishop's position behind the pawn chain. Black prepares to contest the c-file, which is a critical objective in this variation of the Sicilian defense, aiming to challenge white's control and potentially develop attacking chances. The queen now targets the weak b7 square, potentially forcing black to defend passively and preparing to exploit the open c-file. This move prepares to challenge white's queenside pressure and potentially connect the rooks for more active play along the c-file. White doubles the rooks on the semi-open c-file, preparing to challenge black's control and potentially exploit weaknesses in the pawn structure. Castling kingside secures the king and connects the rooks, a standard defensive and developmental move in this Sicilian Najdorf variation. This move aggressively challenges black's central knight and prepares to expand on the kingside. This move is a natural recapture in the Sicilian defense, recapturing the pawn on c6 after white's central pawn push and preparing to develop the queenside pieces. The knight repositions to e5, a central square that may facilitate future pawn breaks or attack weaknesses on the kingside, while preparing for potential exchanges. This move repositions the queen from a potentially vulnerable central square to a more active position on the queenside, supporting a potential queenside expansion and preparing for eventual central play. The queen moves to d1 to connect the rooks and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside or queenside, while also vacating the central d1 square for a rook if needed. This move repositions the bishop to a potentially more active diagonal after the knight has moved away, aiming to support potential kingside counterplay or prepare for a later exchange sacrifice on the d-file. The queen repositions to d2, preparing to connect the rooks and potentially support a kingside attack or a pawn push like g4. This move aims to reposition the knight to a more active square, attacking white's queen and potentially eyeing the c4 pawn or preparing to jump into the more open c-file. This move prepares to expand on the queenside by developing the queenside bishop to b2, reinforcing the pawn chain and potentially creating attacking chances against black's queenside. This move prepares to expand on the queenside, aiming to challenge white's control of the c-file and potentially create attacking chances. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, eyeing the kingside and preparing to support a potential kingside pawn advance while keeping control of the central squares. The knight retreats to a more secure square, allowing the pawn structure on the queenside to remain solid and ready for potential queenside expansion. The queen repositions to f2, preparing to support a potential kingside attack by freeing the d-file for the rook and potentially enabling future g4 gram5 advances. This move initiates a queenside pawn break in the Sicilian defense, aiming to challenge white's central control and open lines for black's pieces. This move prepares to support the central advance with e5, contesting the d-file and potentially opening lines for white's rook. The move 21, nb4 is a dynamic maneuver aiming to displace white's crucial light-squared bishop on d3 and potentially create attacking opportunities on the queenside or center by exploiting the knight's new central outpost. The bishop repositions to f1, potentially to allow the rook on c1 to enter the game more actively on the semi-open c-file after the queen vacates the d-file, or to prepare for a kingside advance. Black breaks open the b-file, aiming to exploit the weakened queenside structure and create counterplay against white's king. White recaptures on c4, opening the b-file for potential future rook activity and challenging black's pawn majority on the queenside while maintaining a solid pawn structure. The move aims to activate the queenside pawns and potentially create a queenside majority or open lines for the rooks. This move, nd4, initiates a strategic redeployment, aiming to centralize the knight and potentially fork the queen and rook on the b8-h2 diagonal, while also preparing to control key central squares. The move 24, ca8 aims to reposition the queen to a more active square, potentially preparing to exploit the queenside or support a queenside pawn push, while also freeing up the d8 square for a potential rook lift. The queen repositions to f3 to better defend the kingside, potentially prepare for an advance of the f-pawn, and keep an eye on the h5 square. The knight repositions to a6, aiming to potentially exchange itself for white's active bishop on d3 or prepare for a queenside pawn push with b5. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, eyeing the c7 pawn and potentially creating pressure along the queenside diagonals. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, eyeing potential outposts and preparing for pawn breaks or piece exchanges in the center. This move aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and create attacking chances on the kingside, potentially opening lines for white's pieces. This captures a central pawn, opening lines and creating dynamic play which requires careful calculation of the ensuing tactical skirmishes. The queen exchange simplifies the position, forcing white to contend with black's active knight on c5 and potentially stronger pawn structure. In the ensuing middle game, this recapture opens lines for black's rooks, particularly the one on a8, and clarifies the pawn structure after the queen trade, preparing to contest the central files. This pawn advance opens the f-file for white's rook and creates an immediate central tension, challenging black's knight and potentially disrupting its control of the d5 square. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to control central squares and potentially pressure white's queenside pawn structure. This move, nd6, aims to exploit the weakened pawn structure after the exchange on a8 by driving the knight towards the opponent's back rank, potentially disrupting their coordination and creating attacking chances on the queenside. This move activates the bishop to a more central square, preparing to contest the d6 pawn and potentially exchange off white's attacking bishop on e3. This capture aims to disrupt black's central control and open lines, but carefully consider if the resulting pawn structure will favor white's endgame prospects. This recapture of the knight offers white a significant advantage in piece activity and central control, as the black knight on e4 is now isolated and vulnerable. This move aggressively challenges black's pawn structure, aiming to open the c-file and create attacking opportunities for white's rooks. The move ing3 attempts to exploit the pin on the d6 pawn and offers a knight sacrifice to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines for black's pieces. This move reinforces the advanced knight on c4, creating a strong outpost and preparing to put pressure on black's queenside pawn structure. This pawn advance on the kingside aims to create space and potentially launch a counterplay against white's queen and bishop, while also freeing up the knight on g3 for further activity. This move aims to reposition the bishop to a more active square on the queenside, potentially supporting a pawn advance or defending against black's intended kingside expansion. This pawn advances to create a space for the knight to potentially reposition, while simultaneously preventing white's bishop from establishing an outpost on g5 and bolstering the kingside defense. This capture clarifies the pawn structure on the kingside and exchanges a potentially active piece for a defender, aiming to simplify the position while retaining a strategic advantage. This pawn capture, 35, hxg3, opens the h-file for the rook and prepares to develop the knight to a more active square, while also solidifying white's pawn structure in the center. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square where it controls the long diagonal and supports the potential pawn advance on d5, aiming to restrict black's piece mobility. This exchange simplifies the position, removing black's active bishop and creating a potentially weaker pawn structure on the queenside for white, while also opening the b-file for black's rook. This capture on b5 is crucial for regaining material equality and simplifying the position, opening up potential attacking lines for white's remaining pieces. This move opens a crucial diagonal for the black bishop and creates immediate attacking chances on the king side, forcing white to defend. This move aggressively occupies the 7th rank, targeting black's weakened pawns and preparing to penetrate the enemy position to disrupt their coordination. The bishop retreats to a more passive square, ceding control of the d8-h4 diagonal and failing to address the persistent threat of the white rook on d7. This move repositions the rook to an active file, aiming to exploit the open nature of the c-file and potentially control squares that are currently weak for black, especially after the recent exchange of pieces. This move resolves the pawn tension in the center, creating an open file for white's rook while black centralizes their knight, aiming to contest the remaining open lines. This move wins a pawn by exploiting the weakness on g3 and forcing black's rook to abandon its support of the important d8 square. The move is a natural regrouping to bring the rook to a more active central file, aiming to challenge white's control of the 7th rank and potentially create counterplay against white's kingside. This move initiates an exchange of rooks, aiming to simplify the position and exploit white's better placed pieces, particularly the knight on d6. After the rook exchange, this move captures the rook and activates the king, which is crucial in the endgame for supporting passed pawns and participating in strategic maneuvering. This move creates a powerful passed c-pawn, which will force black to commit significant resources to stop its advance, potentially opening lines for white's pieces. This check forces white to move their king to an exposed square, potentially allowing black to exploit the open c-file and white's weakened kingside pawn structure. With the opponent's king exposed after the discovered check, this move activates your king to a more central and secure square, preparing to support the pawn push and defend against potential counterplay. The king re-enters the game to support the pawn structure and prepare for potential pawn breakthroughs on the queenside. This move creates a passed pawn that, if supported, will become a significant threat and a potential game winner. This move aims to defend the threatened rook on c8 with the king, but it also concedes the c7 square to white's pawn, which will then become a dangerous passed pawn. This move aims to solidify white's queenside pawn structure and prevent black's active pieces from infiltrating after the impending pawn advances. The move creates a strong passed pawn on e4, which will require careful maneuvering to support an advance while also considering the king's safety. This is a crucial moment where white must activate their king to protect the passed pawn and prepare for the endgame struggle against black's active pieces. This move aims to solidify the pawn chain and support the advanced e-pawn, which is crucial for controlling central squares and potentially creating a passed pawn. This move activates the rook, preparing to contest the open c-file and potentially create threats against black's king or pawns. The move 47, bd4, aims to activate the bishop and challenge white's control of the d4 square, potentially preparing to support the d-pawn's advance or offer exchanges to simplify the position. This move creates a crucial passed pawn on the h-file, aiming to advance it to the 7th rank to become a decisive threat. This move is a strategic repositioning, aiming to place the bishop on a more active diagonal to pressure white's potential queenside majority or support a future pawn advance. while simultaneously avoiding capture and maintaining flexibility.